placed to help with that crystal ball. Both have deep understanding of the electric vehicle market, policy, and generally the policy environment in Australia. Behyad is the CEO and founder of EVC, the peak national body representing the electric vehicle industry. And we have Sam McLean from Tesla, who manages business development policy. Sam is here to speak more broadly about EV policy and not necessarily just from Tesla's perspective. Along with people like Scott Nagar at Hyundai, Sam has been a driving force in the agenda for the electric vehicle environment in Australia. So as you look outside your windows today and see clean air, it is possible that we can see this every day if we move to electric vehicles. And you can reflect with the right policy in place, that could be possible as well as meeting our carbon emission targets. So will EVs be swept up in the big spending plans of policymakers as we roll out infrastructure and build new manufacturing, or not? Let's have the discussion. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Behyad, who will kick off first. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dan. If we bear with me for just one moment while I open up my slide deck here. There we are. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us all today. It's great to be back presenting to this audience. I know it was only I think a few months ago, in one of the beginnings of this of Chat Together Fleets when we last spoke. And sorry, I'm doing something wrong here. If you just bear with me there. There we go. So we wanted to talk about a few things. Sam and I were discussing a bit how our presentations are going to align today, and I think both of us expressed that we both really do prefer to have a presentation, prefer to answer questions and have a conversation with everyone. We know that we've got an audience of people who are respective experts in their fields and have been looking at electrification for a while. So what we wanted to make sure was we could provide some information up front, but we're both quite eager to get through that relatively quickly so that we can have a back and forth with all of you and answer any questions that you may have. So please get those ready as we're going along, and looking forward to the chat afterwards. Now, sorry, I am having some trouble here. Where I thought I would start is, like with most of the conversations you all may be having, is how is the COVID epidemic impacting the transition to electrification, and particularly now, where are the opportunities? In a lot of the conversations that we're having with governments right across Australia, and quite similarly hearing partner organisations to ours having right around the world as well, is, as you can appreciate, many governments are looking at today, at the moment, how we can continue surviving and continue supporting our economies and our people through what is occurring right now. But then also, once the dust does settle and we have some more certainty about what the environment will look like moving forward, is how do we start jump-starting economies again and providing stimulus to get people back at work, get money flowing back through our economy. And there's a key area where we're seeing that the existing support for governments for electrification, as well as the unique opportunity in the new vehicle sales market, provided by some of the dynamics of the impact of electrification on new vehicle sales, is really pointing the finger towards once the worst of this pandemic, for lack of a better word, by using the word worst, passes, how can we help stimulate what is a market that employs quite a number of people in the vehicle manufacturing around the world, but also in dealerships, servicing, and in other mobility services. So the flow-on impacts of a strong vehicle sales market here in Australia. Two key things to look at here and what helps inform that discussion. Of course, there is the larger, and what we'll get to, the larger benefits of supporting electrification regardless. But particularly when we look at what have been trends inside of the new vehicle sales market overall, both throughout last year and then now through the impacts here in Australia of sales, both as a result of the bushfires earlier in the year and COVID now, what we're seeing is two pretty compelling narratives that again are reinforced by other global markets as well. So not particularly unique there. What I'll say is, before I launch into this, there's a small caveat that the numbers, I've used percentages here, that numbers in electric vehicle sales versus internal combustion engine sales are of course very different. But if we do look at what the trends do look like again, what this first slide is showing us is that on the right-hand side, right across 2019, we saw a very large surge in electric vehicle sales, accounting for almost a 300% increase from electric vehicle sales in 2018. While during that same year, there was roughly an 8% decrease in all new vehicle sales, in petrol and diesel new vehicle sales. Now, this has been a trend in the new vehicle sales for petrol and diesel vehicles for the past 2 or 3 years. That industry will tell you that they've been facing a recession, and it's been a difficult time even before the COVID pandemic. But again, that shining light right around the world and reflected here in Australia has been new electric vehicle sales continuing to grow. Now, as we look in this year, of course, we would expect to see something quite different because of the unique impacts of what's been occurring. But again, when we look, we're seeing close to, from January to now, close to about a 90% increase in electric vehicle sales from the previous year, where we already saw a 300-fold increase, and still roughly about a 20% decrease in new vehicle sales for all non-electric vehicles. So again, for government policy making, this provides a very clear picture on we'd already like to be supporting a transition towards electrification, and now also we see that this is the way that the market is gradually, although from a very low base, gradually starting to shift. So it does start to make a lot of sense today, and an increasing amount of sense to direct those stimulus measures towards where the market is heading towards, and particularly where you as a government would like the market to head towards. Now, again, I mentioned a bit around this has been well reflected around the rest of the world. I spoke a bit about this the last time we were together, so I won't I won't stay on this area for too long. But again, I think really key to what we've seen globally is not just the number of electric vehicles being sold. On the left-hand side there, you're seeing the annual sales of electric vehicles. So they're not cumulative; they are they are annual there. And really importantly, what we talk about when it comes to supporting a technological transition, we're really looking for the time when the market is ready enough that we're shifting from gradual incremental growth towards exponential growth. And what we've seen is that from around 2011 to 2015, it took about that 4 or 5 year period to sell 1 million electric vehicles around the world. Following that, it took about 13, 14 months to sell another 1 million electric vehicles. And today we're in a period where about every 5 months we're selling yet another million EVs on the road. So getting closer and closer towards that tipping point where the shift from 2 or 3 million vehicles in a year to close to the 700 to 1 billion vehicles that are being sold all around the world becoming electric. That shift is much faster. So this is a 10-year period to get towards 2 to 3 million vehicle sales, and then another 10-year period to become the majority of all new vehicles being sold, and starting to positively see those numbers continue to shift. And then a bit there on the right-hand side, where I really wanted to start moving towards in the conversation was, and particularly I guess in the question and answer section, we can talk about what policies we are working on to develop across Australia. And what we hear a lot, and what people like me like to say quite a lot, is that Australia does not have national electric vehicle policy or very strong electric vehicle government policies in place. I'd like to spend a bit more time talking about what good policy does look like and what we're seeing around the world that has supported this shift. Here we can see on the right-hand side that outside of outlier countries in Scandinavia, particularly Norway, Norway being at around now, I think 62% of new vehicle sales being electric. This was the 56 number was 2019. Elsewhere in the world, across the EU, North America, Asia, that global average looks somewhere closer to around 3.9 to 4.2% of new vehicle sales being electric. Meanwhile, Australia last year sat at 0.6% of new vehicle sales. So while we're talking about the impact of policy or the need for policy to help support the transition towards EVs, I think we can quite often get very caught up talking about, what about people in very unique use cases, and does the technology support them today? But quite interestingly, we are talking about an environment where we need to move from 0.6% of new vehicle sales to around 4%. In figurative terms, that's the difference between last year, Australia sold 6,718 electric vehicles. To be on par with the global average, we should have sold around 40 or 50,000 of the 1.17 million vehicles sold in the country. So again, a very achievable target. Well, it looks, and we are very far behind, and it looks like we're very far behind. That is an extra, tens of thousands, an extra scores of thousands of new electric vehicles being sold for us to catch up. So that ability to catch up is also there. Slide doesn't go forward when I wanted to. Here we go, a little bit more showing what that growth in Australian electric vehicle sales has looked like. And as I mentioned there, it's really been that last year and in the introduction of a few new models of electric vehicles that's helped the market take off and reach that 6,718 number. Sam will be speaking just after me, so we can talk a little bit more maybe about the impact of new vehicles in helping grow that market. Now, briefly, a bit around what it is that we're trying to achieve with what it is we are trying to achieve through policy. What are the aims of the policies? There's something I can't stress enough is that with the work that we're doing, policy isn't the end game here. We're not trying to get electric vehicle policies for the sake of it, but we look at the impact of not having these policies in place when every other market around the world does. And the impact translates very directly into investment uncertainty. So whether you're a vehicle OEM, a charging network provider, or providing other electric mobility services, you are looking at a global environment where there are very strong and supportive policies in place, and then in Australia where there is none, that creates issues for your business case here in Australia. And the result of those are the market barriers that we face today and the obstacles that we face in Australia today. And they look like low model availability and a low volume of electric vehicle models being imported to Australia, and many of the models that are available being at a higher cost. That in turn turns into a difficult business case for further restricting the investments in particularly publicly available fast charging infrastructure. I think this is something that can make quite simple sense, is that a charging network provider wants to see electric vehicle driving customers in order to make their business case stack up, and without those customers, it's harder to do so. And as a result of the other two not being there, the vehicles and the charges amount being restricted, you have low consumer awareness. So again, I'd like to explain these barriers in that very simple way to identify how interlinked they all are, and the ability to overcome each of those to reach that 50, 100,000 electric vehicle sales in the short term. The challenges that we are facing aren't a barrier from needing to invent new electric vehicles or letting the technology develop further or working out how to deploy fast charging around the world. They are really around, there is a gap there in investment certainty, and how can government step in to help address some of those market failures to help kick off this transition in Australia. A bit here around what those policies need to look like and what some of the keys are now. What we see here is that in Australia, when it comes to our road fleet of vehicles, the key piece that's missing, that exists in about 80% of the new vehicle sales market today, is the lack of, and alternatively called, fuel efficiency standards, CO2 standards, cord per average feet standards. Not being in place in Australia has meant that our fleet of vehicles on roads are usually on average, less efficient than elsewhere. It does mean that to travel 1 kilometre, you'd require more fuel than you would need to elsewhere. That's a number of, there's a number of factors there: driving larger cars, heavier vehicles, not so much driving further distances, which a lot of people think is an issue. It's a per kilometre efficiency challenge, not a total travelled efficiency challenge. What we see on the right here is looking at a couple of the markets that do have these measures in place and the impact of Australia not. What you can see quite clearly is that what other markets such as the EU and the US have been experiencing, and then in the later years projecting, have been increasing fuel efficiency. It's a very good proxy here for vehicle technology in total. Of vehicle efficiency essentially means that the manufacturer is adding technology to the vehicle or adding innovation to the vehicle in order to make it more efficient, require less fuel as it runs. And again, Australia not having those in place, there's been a business as usual reduction. This has largely been the innovation occurs elsewhere, and arrives in Australia at a later date. It sort of arrives here eventually, but with a tail. Now, this has been, there's been an issue within the new vehicle sales market or within the road fleet for quite some time, and it's now affecting electric vehicle availability as well. So there's an electric vehicle only issue, but it is certainly flowing onto electric vehicles. I'm just going to keep an eye on the time as well. I realize I've been speaking for a while already. So I'll just touch a bit quickly. I think what I'll do is just go over my next couple of slides and then pitch over to Sam before we do a Q&A. So the fuel efficiency standards have been in place across the rest of the world for quite a number of years now. The US first implemented theirs, which is called a corporate average fleet emission standard, under the Carter administration in 1976. So Australia's absence of having one is really, it's quite startling. We'd like to explain for global investors, it's like arriving to a country that doesn't have roads and thinking about how to implement electric vehicles. What has occurred more recently and over the last decade has been a number of sort of encouraging or incentivizing measures to ensure that those efficiency standards are met through electric vehicles particularly. And I'll particularly touch on this in the context of some of the work that we're doing here in Australia. We'll speak a little later about some of the programs in New South Wales and Victoria, Queensland, and hopefully in not too long Western Australia. And particularly around the amounts and the types of efforts seen there compared to what we're seeing in other OECD countries and what's driving the market in those places. You can see on this slide that on average, the type of incentive ranges around the $8,000 to $10,000 mark provided for a new light vehicle being sold, and then more so again for a heavy vehicle or a van being sold inside of those markets. A few of the key ones that have, and again, these have been incentives that have been in place for either over or close to a decade, in most of these marketplaces. So very large budget outlays usually provided through tax exemptions, so in revenue not being collected by governments. And it's really aimed at, once these other measures have been in place, once there are targets allocated towards either fleet efficiency or electric vehicle targets, ensuring that these are being met by rewarding the customer or incentivizing the customer to purchase the vehicle. Really, the aim of these are ensuring that when a customer shows up at a dealership or looks online at vehicles, that the electric vehicle option is cheaper and they're encouraged to pick that one over a petrol and diesel one. So very importantly, these are structured in such a way that they're able to be reflected in the upfront price of the vehicle. Particularly when we're talking about private consumers, it's an area that we know private consumers don't walk around with spreadsheets. They're looking at a sticker on the price of the vehicle. They have the budget that they have. So if your vehicle doesn't enter within their budget, it's not something that's available to them. And in fact, what we see in the purchasing journey of private consumers, which is increasingly and majorly online today, is they'll look for vehicles within their price range, filtering out those that are not. So if we have the example of electric vehicles where their total cost of ownership is lower or their operating costs are lower each year, but the upfront price is higher, they're not seeing that vehicle to begin with if the incentive or if the price overall doesn't fit within their budget. I'll skip a few of these, but just a couple more here. I spoke then about, with those measures in place, what is it that these countries are trying to achieve? And again, we see right around the world a number of targets in place, either to, where I put 100% here, this is usually not 100% electric vehicles, it's usually a target of banning the sale of internal combustion engines, or alternatively that targets, as in the case of the last few, there being a volume target rather than a percentage of fleet target. What I might do there, I've already spoken for a while and I think gone over time, so what I might do there is stop my part of the presentation and hand back to Dan to introduce Sam, if that's okay.
Yeah, great, Behyad. Thank you very much. That was really interesting as always. And as Sam, I'm sure, is getting ready, we all are aware of the inroads that Tesla's made in the last year, and in general, I guess, the leading position that they've taken in the market in terms of driving policy and driving the vision of the market. So I'll hand over to you, Sam, and if people do want to type in questions, go for it. It's a bit quiet there in the moment. So, chuck some stuff in there. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Behyad. And I might just pause before I start kind of downloading information to everyone to ask everybody to jump on that chat or just unmute yourself and jump in with some questions or guidance for me on kind of what would be most interesting to hear. If I don't hear anything, then I'll just tell you what I think is, what I think is most useful fill of 10 minutes. But I'd love any questions or guidance, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So is anyone who wants to give me direction, jump on now.
Yeah, I'll watch the chat and let you know if there's anything comes up.
In the absence of that, for the meantime, let me find the right screen to share. Anthony, do you think there'll be any incentives for vehicle to grid? How can the impacts of EV batteries be reduced, and how is this addressed in mining and reuse and recycling? How can this be addressed in policy? Yeah, good. I don't have slides on either of those, but I will make sure we cover them. when is my Model Y coming? Good question, Mike. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't have an answer. Is Tesla going to enter the market for small EVs in the future? My guess is as good as yours, Caspar, but I would say that the next kind of 4 or 5 years of our product pipeline is pretty clearly articulated, and it's rather large, Cybertrucks and semis and so forth, and Y getting bigger than 3. So I would say that the overall trend doesn't look like it's getting smaller. It looks like it's getting bigger. Vehicle to grid. We'll come back to vehicle to grid. So let's. Is the change in oil price going to affect EV uptake? Yes, it probably. I think it will, particularly for fleets. It makes the TCO calculations much less favourable to us, and so I think it makes our kind of what's already a bit of an uphill battle in fleets also kind of into the wind as well. But I think it matters much less. We're seeing it matter much less for kind of mum and dad customers at home. Do we think FBT will apply to EVs? Yeah. So good question again, Anthony. FBT. So FBT does apply to EVs, and it applies kind of more to EVs. So fringe benefits tax, which is what people pay on salary sacrificed vehicles, etc. It does apply to electric vehicles, and it applies more to electric vehicles than to most other vehicles on the road, which if you're a fleet manager for a council or you deal with private fleets, you're probably aware of just how kind of difficult that can be. Because fringe benefits tax is calculated as a percentage of the overall price of the vehicle. And as Behyad has been saying, the overall price of an EV is sometimes a little bit higher than an equivalent ICE EV. And so when you're calculating from a higher price, what the fringe benefits tax will be, obviously the EVs get hit harder. And then also are not eligible for some of the deductions around petrol, because under the relevant legislation, you can only claim deduction for liquid petrols for your vehicle. So you can't claim a deduction for your electricity or for the solar to generate that electricity and whatnot. And there's much less maintenance costs in some EVs. So your maintenance deductions are lower as well. So you end up being at a disadvantage with electric vehicles. Lobbying around the removal of luxury car tax. Catherine is a really, yes, absolutely a scope for lobbying for that, and I'll actually touch on that on the slides, so I'll come back to that. Increased asset write-off, and will that affect EVs? Is another question coming through. So this is great. I'll try to cover some of this in my presentation, and then save some of these to share with Behyad. So have I got my screen working? You all can see that okay now?
Yeah, proceed now.
Great. One of the worst things about presenting with Behyad is that, well, he's funnier than me, which is annoying, but also a lot of the slides that I use are stolen from his decks, so I can't reuse them with you guys because he's just showed you them. So I'll have to skip those ones. But here's one I pulled together, which illustrates kind of in a different graphic way the point that Behyad was making with one of his slides, which is the huge gap in the straight up financial incentive that EVs have in Australia versus other countries. So I've tried to pull together, and this is not an exact dollar figure because some of the incentives are a little bit more complicated than just an exact dollar figure. So I've tried to approximate a dollar figure in US dollars. basically, what is a consumer getting on in an incentive to buy an EV? And I've in some places the incentives apply differently to different types of vehicles. So because I kind of have been looking at things through a Tesla lens, this is the kind of incentive that will apply to a Model 3-like vehicle, which is why you can see Denmark on the end doesn't have anything. That's a long story. So you can see on the kind of left-hand side of the screen are all the countries that have quite high incentives, and you can approximate them to as high as 20, but around about $10,000 US. The median and the mean here is about $6,100 US and $6,400 respectively. So you can see that most of the countries that we're comparing to that have established policies have a significant financial incentive, and it averages out around $6,500 US. And if you look at that through the kind of current AUD conversion lens, it's well over it's in the 10 grand Australian mark. And then there's Australia with on the right hand side there with absolutely kind of nothing to speak of. Not completely accurate, of course, if you're in the ACT and you have a stamp duty exemption, and in some states you have smaller stamp duty and rego discounts. But for the most part, we're talking about a couple $100 there, which isn't going to factor. Most of the research has kind of showed that incentives don't work unless they're applied upfront on the purchase price of the vehicle, are really clearly communicated, and are well over kind of $3,000 US, which is why all these countries have these policies. So there are lots of other differences in the policy. There are lots of other ways that we're falling behind as well. We're starting to, in Australia, get some great kind of grants for rolling out fast charging. We're starting to get some good vision from state governments that in kind of non-financial ways, fleet transitions, etc. But you can kind of just look at the dollars here and see that Australia is a long way behind. And then the other part of this graph, which Becky had also touched on briefly, is kind of what is the money behind that for manufacturers. So if you're selling a vehicle in any of the states that participate in the Californian ZEV scheme, then as a manufacturer you're looking at a couple $1,000 minimum kind of upside, which is the value of the credit that you get for selling an electric vehicle. Similarly, in Europe, you can group comply, and so the benefit to OEMs, to manufacturers, is going to be a couple $1,000 as well. So we wonder why we don't have very many electric vehicles for sale in Australia. Part of it is that as a manufacturer, you just got to look at this and say, where am I going to send my vehicles? Obviously, the best place to send them is going to be elsewhere. So the question is kind of like, if you don't work directly in policy, what difference does all of this make to your part of the electric vehicle sector? What difference does it make to you as a council or a charging installer or wherever you fit in the pie? And basically, it just means that our kind of lack of policy means we're way behind on all the things that matter to you. So the vehicles that you're trying to get into fleets are more expensive and harder to come by. The charging infrastructure is not being rolled out and there isn't as much demand for it, etc. And you can see kind of in a fairly quantifiable way what difference policy makes for EV uptake in Australia based on the forecasts that have been done for the Clean Energy Finance Corp and ARENA, and for the federal departments as well. The simplest kind of graph that I like to show to demonstrate how big a gap there is between different policy approaches is this one, which is a forecast of adoption. It's being updated at the moment. But the grey line that you see there, which is called decarbonisation, is really where we need to be in order to do our part in order for EVs to be part of us meeting a 1.5 or 2 degree world. So in order to avoid terrible bushfire seasons like the one we've seen, in order to avoid large parts of several Australian cities going underwater within the next 30 years, in order to avoid 80% of the world's animals going extinct by 2050, in order to avoid all of the rapidly escalating, warnings that scientists are giving us, that's the path we have to be on. And it sees the last kind of combustion engine vehicle sold in Australia in the mid 2030s. And the reason for that is that we talk a lot about 2045 and 2050 as emissions reduction targets of being at zero or net zero. And we know that vehicles are on the road for 20 years on average in Australia. So you have to sell the last vehicles in 5 to 10 years' time. The kind of peachy light red color that you see there is what they forecast as a likely action, which basically is a fairly strong set of EV policies that include some upfront incentives or cash incentives, significant investments in charging, and changes to luxury car tax and fringe benefits tax, etc. And the dark red line is the line that we continue to track on, which is no action, no significant action policy. So you can see that kind of the policy makes the major difference between us being on a pathway to a happy world and a pathway to just being decades further behind. So what are the kind of major levers to pull? Well, look, there are dozens and dozens of levers to pull, and the Electric Vehicle Council does an incredible job of, I'll get my screen back, of coming up with really detailed policies and bringing them to governments of all stripes. These are my pet policies that I think are the kind of biggest levers for governments to pull on, and they kind of speak to some of the questions that we had earlier. One is fringe benefits tax. And so if fringe benefits tax applies, it applies more to EVs than to other cars. And if you think about the fact that the highest selling cars in Australia are utes, well, there's a reason for that. Utes are up to 100% exempt of fringe benefits tax for many buyers, and that's at a cost of kind of multiple billions of dollars a year. So we have the money to subsidise vehicles, and we already do. We just subsidise mainly dual cab, highly polluting vehicles. Now, if we took a fraction of the FBT, of the fringe benefits tax exemption that we give to utes and apply them to electric vehicles, we'd be on a different line in the previous graph. So this is a really key piece for fleet transitions. It's a really key piece for novated leases and leasing. Most of the levers are with the federal government, and the solutions for them are kind of 100% or 50% fringe benefits tax deductions, which could be for a short amount of time, and which we've kind of modeled out the cost of fairly accurately. It's pretty cheap, really. You can do it for $130 million. The second area is kind of correcting problems with the luxury car tax. So if you're buying an electric vehicle in Australia, there's a good chance that you're paying luxury car tax at the moment because of the higher prices. And we have the most alarming thing that I think we as an industry, are not making a lot of noise about at the moment is that we have this funny situation where in a couple of years' time, somebody buying a Tesla Model 3 is going to be paying a higher rate of luxury car tax than somebody who's buying a combustion engine, an inefficient 10 litres per 100k petrol engine. They're going to pay more luxury car tax percentage-wise. Because the policy was designed in a crazy way where one rate of luxury car tax is indexed to a different is indexed differently to fuel-efficient cars. And so by 2024-25, we're actually going to pay more luxury car tax on EVs and other efficient cars. And so what's really required in the luxury car tax space is just a kind of fix to the mistakes that have been made, and you can actually save money there to pay for the other areas that we've outlined. And then, of course, getting charging out of the fast charging out of the slow lane in Australia is something that we're starting to make much more progress on. It's really promising that New South Wales, in particular, is looking at escalating that, and Queensland and Victoria have already put forward money from state governments as well. So I think those are the three kind of biggest policy levers that we have, which is not to say that there aren't dozens of others, but I think those are the biggest levers that federal governments have to pull. the state level, the biggest levers are stamp duty exemptions. That knocks a couple $1,000s off the upfront price of a lot of cars, and the costs are relatively small over the next couple of years for most states, in the area of kind of 50 to 70 million. Charging hubs, EV-ready bills, and right-to-charge bills, which are about changing the way that new developments are made so that they're ready for electric vehicle charging, and ensuring that renters and apartment owners can install charging very quickly, which I think is a problem that we see a lot of. In Australia, we have people who show up to purchase EVs, and then they put down a deposit. They're really keen to go, and they can't follow through because they don't have. It's really hard to get charging installed if you live in a strata sometimes, and it requires motivated owners. So there are a huge number of other policy levers to pull as well, but those are the kind of four of the bigger ones. And I think let me finish with this slide, which is based on some excellent work that the EV Council did last year in New South Wales, which looked at government's own data to stack up kind of the pollution and health impacts of EVs. So government spent hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising campaigns and other policy measures to reduce the road toll. And it's tragic that about 1,500 people die on roads in accidents every year, or I think it's 1,200 last year. But it seems to be more tragic because it's more visible and more visceral. When people die in an accident, it's so much more visible to the public than the impacts of smoke and pollution. But I think we found out over last summer, before this health crisis, the last thing we were worried about was air pollution, because we were breathing it in and we could see it over summer in a lot of places. But even when we can't see it and it's not bushfire smoke, air pollution is a huge problem and is killing 12 times more Australians than drink driving, and 4 times more Australians than speeding, and that's just from the pollution from vehicles. So I think we have multiple arguments to make as a sector that are really compelling. One is about climate change and how quickly we need to move onto different lines, and another is about the immediate health impacts of vehicles. And I think one of the challenges, one of the things we have to remember as a sector, right across the board, is no matter where you are in our kind of electric vehicle sector, we have to be making noise. One of the if electric vehicles are too quiet, we are not going to we're not going to get the policy attention we deserve. There's of course the saying that this squeaky wheel gets the grease, and electric vehicles unfortunately are not going to get the grease if we don't speak up, which means that when we run into problems, when we have customers walking into our stores at Tesla who can't install charging and therefore aren't buying, we need to find those customers and help them to reach out to their members of public. We need to tell policymakers about those problems. And if you're in a part of the sector where you're seeing a barrier, I think that one of the key things we have to do is constantly be re-articulating that barrier that we're seeing to policymakers at all levels. So hopefully I've covered a couple of the questions there about LCT, etc., that people have had. I'll quickly talk about the increased asset write-off, which Anthony asked about as well. So this was a measure introduced as a kind of coronavirus stimulus package in the round 1 of stimulus, which was to allow businesses to do an increased and accelerated depreciation and write-off on assets that they'd buy. They moved that kind of asset limit from $20,000 to $100,000, which means that suddenly EVs and other vehicles are in the policy, in the price mark. And businesses can claim a lot of tax write-offs in the first couple of years. I think we haven't seen that flow through to a huge amount of sales so far, because I don't think it's well understood yet. And I think we need to do a better job as a sector of writing op-eds and getting pieces out there to show that. The EVC does a great job with that, but we all as members have to communicate as well. Dan,
I can just jump in if you like. I can ask you.
Helping me to.
Yeah, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you. That was great. Thank you, Sam. That was really, really interesting and a great call to action as well. I guess just one question before I jump into others just occurred to me as you were speaking about consumers kind of making noise and fleets. I mean, we've got a lot of fleet people on the line today. We tried to do like an aggregated buying procurement program. We've tried to do several things to sort of help aggregate that voice, because there's certainly a lot of excited and keen fleet managers and sustainability managers trying to do things. I mean, is there a way we can amplify and leverage that voice? Because we have found it quite difficult, but we're very keen to do it through this kind of program if we can.
Behyad, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I will do. Thanks a lot for that presentation, Dan, and thanks for the question. Look, I think definitely a very strong and important role for fleet buyers in these benefits around electrification that Sam outlined and I was touching on. We've been spending a lot of time explaining to governments who are ultimately the decision makers on bringing these policies forward. I always like to say that from our perspective, we've been at this since 2016, and evidence and research has never been our challenge. Our challenge has been political will to get some of these things done. And the most compelling line that we have, with all of those benefits outlined, is that there are businesses and the private sector, they're ready to invest. And ours is never a message of government, you should go do everything to make this work. It is the Electric Vehicle Council's members are ready to invest in the e-mobility sector. They're looking for some more certainty through these policies to enable that to occur. And then, of course, the other very important part of that is once all that investment occurs, that there are customers also looking to purchase these vehicles. And I think a really strong role there for fleet customers to, first of all, show that this is actually something that we and our businesses want to do. There are issues, there are barriers, and government policy support is meant to be there to help us overcome those barriers so that we can get on with doing our part of the job, which is purchasing these vehicles and running our businesses with them. And then also really important there to explain more particularly what those are. When we talk about things like removing fringe benefits tax from electric vehicle sales for fleets, for instance, we provide them the impact of that on a cost model, on a spreadsheet or whatever else. And as you can appreciate, you've just sat through all of it a bit. Having somebody sit down with a spreadsheet and explain to you the impact of a tax that reflects the upfront price of the vehicle and how it makes it more difficult for somebody to purchase an electric vehicle is one thing. But hearing from businesses who are actually trying to make that journey themselves is a much more real and tangible conversation for policymakers to be having. So again, I think really important for them to hear very directly from the people that we're ultimately trying to influence, which is the people who are actually going to do the purchasing of these vehicles.
I guess something that sort of came up before was you're going to talk about some of the initiatives around the country I know there's exciting stuff coming out of New South Wales and other states. I mean, can you talk any more about any of those initiatives or where you see them going?
Yeah, happy to. I think the one that's that we can speak about the most, because most of it or more of it rather, has been released, is in the case of New South Wales. What we'd say is there are a few more schemes being developed across other states as well. And my hesitance to speak about those isn't that I don't want to let you inside the fold. It's that until things are announced, they're only things that we're working on, and we don't want to sort of provide information that doesn't ultimately make it to the final draft. And isn't that useful to people to sort of get your hopes up and then not have something available? But particularly to a few schemes that the New South Wales government's looking at. I'll talk about them very quickly in ascending order of relevance and interest to this audience. So programs focused on, a little while ago, you may have heard the New South Wales Transport Minister say that of the 8,000 buses in operation in our state, our goal is to make 100% of them electric. There's no date set there or no mechanism set behind it, but the message has been sent very clearly to bus operators and tenderers of the bus network that the people who tender for the most electric vehicles in their fleets will continue to win. And then at a certain point, the people who don't, people who are still trying to tender for non-electric buses will miss out entirely. So it's setting a very clear direction, and some of the work around policy now being developed. There is a parliamentary hearing, and also through the climate change framework, or the net zero targets team being set to actually help develop what support is going to go in within that. A lot of that, and what hearing from industry is, a lot of that is not particularly financial. It is around overcoming sort of technical barriers and providing people certainty of offtake of the vehicles. The other portion is for the New South Wales government's own fleet of vehicles. They currently have a target of 10% electrification, including mild hybrids, recognising that that's a slightly quite out-of-date target for today's environment. So revisiting that and planning a more ambitious target for their own fleet of vehicles, really in that case as well. And what's very important about government fleet targets, there's the obvious parts of putting your money where your mouth is and actually doing things as well. And it's not necessarily that governments have such massive fleets that it's very important that they set these targets, but by being much more agenda-driven, actually trying to reach the desired outcomes, our hope and inclination is to work with them on these programs to sort of learn what some of those, whether it's New South Wales specific or Australia specific issues are, how a sort of much more directive government can help overcome them, and then be able to provide that support out to the rest of the fleet market as well. So by having a sort of very strong, a powerful purchaser there, able to really move the needle so that everyone else can ride that wave. Some funding being allocated to match funding for charging infrastructure. And then finally, I think for this audience, the most relevant being the development of a reverse auction scheme to provide a fleet incentive for electric vehicles. People from the energy sector would sort of have participated in a reverse auction scheme before for renewable energy, but in essence, it's a bucket of money with a reverse auction program, essentially saying for fleets to bid how many vehicles you would electrify for how much money, and the people who electrify more vehicles for less money will continue to win until all of that money runs out. Some really important, not caveats, but really important qualifications in there, though, very relevant to Charge Together fleets, because a few other, as this continues to be developed, we'll start to see a few other states add programs similar to this as well. And it is specifically a fleet incentive for a reason, and their intention is that people participating in these programs have done some type of work like what the Charge Together fleets provides. And in some of their announcements and some of their workshops, a few of the states have very specifically said Charge Together fleets is exactly what we're talking about here, and don't come to us and ask for an incentive for your fleet if you haven't done any research in the first place. And this should be very easy because there's a free program available to you where you can do some of this research. And they're really looking for people who have done some of that work, have long-term fleet electrification goals of their own as a business, looking to invest for themselves, and have identified, a delta, whether it's directly relevant to the price of the vehicle or otherwise, that would help them finally cross the line and do what more large-scale electrification. So it is a program. While this last part of it isn't finalised, really what we're hearing from the government is that they're looking for people to make bids of quite a lot of vehicles at a time, or for a large percentage of their own fleets, rather than people looking to buy one or two vehicles if they are large fleet owners. If you're a small vehicle owner and one or two vehicles is actually a lot for you, I think that they'll probably be treated differently. But this is really moving the conversation on from people buying demonstration vehicles or buying a sort of branded one-off vehicle to helping you go on the journey towards full fleet electrification.
And the question just came in around local government. I guess maybe Sam, Tesla's had a lot of experience implementing fast chargers in local government, but I mean, I think in general with the audience today, what other things can local governments do to get on board and help drive the policy agenda forward?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I saw Cecilia and a few others on that thread in the chat. I think, look, I'm not totally expert at local council policy, and I think that probably the first thing to do is to steal the homework of some of the other councils who have really been leading the way. And I think Behyad can probably do a better job of pointing to which of those councils are currently kind of in the best position to share good practice. But I've seen, there are Moreland and others in Melbourne, and there are a bunch of other good examples. And the EBC is a good resource for getting notes about that. There you go. Hi, Cecilia. And the other program that's really good for local councils beyond EVs is I'll flick a link around. There's a couple of great climate collaborations for councils. So I think those are the directions I would point, but I won't give further detail because I'm not the expert.
Yeah, and I would just say Alexandra Kelly, who's on the line, and you can be reached via alexandra@abc.org.au, is pulling together a document for local councils, taking on some of the best practices and lessons learned from different councils to be able to share to others. And I think really what gets me quite excited, or I like to see from local councils, is the obvious getting your own house in order and providing some of those right to charge. Reaching out to people in providing charging infrastructure, looking at how else you can support consumers, whether it's through providing charging infrastructure, preferential parking spaces or others. And again, the other and the very impactful things that we've seen from local councils has been when they've grouped together. So you may know the Central Victorian Greenhouse Alliance has recently released a report around their charging the regions and some of the work that they're doing to help attract private industry to come and invest within their regions to provide some of that infrastructure. Again, that power of several councils getting together, it does a few very useful things. It obviously increases the market power of the councils, but it also sends, I think what industry is really looking for is a very clear signal that this is an area that is supportive and we want to do this. And I think it's one of the key things when we talk about policy. The first and very impactful thing that those policies do before you get down to the nuts and bolts is send out a flare to say electric vehicles are going on here, we want it to happen, and that gets a lot of people's attention. The other thing that I would say for local councils is give some thought to where you are. We've worked with some great local councils who are in regional areas with who have very influential federal members of parliament, and usually you may be a mayor of a regional area and the deputy prime minister is your federal member of parliament, and you're going to have a much better relationship than we would. And if he's hearing directly from people like that we care about this issue and we want to see it move, well, we've gone straight to the top. We've gone to the transport minister and it's not sort of, I think that shifting conversation is a very different conversation from somebody like that to hear that the Electric Vehicle Council thinks we should be doing more about electric vehicles than their own region or their own council saying so.
Okay. Look, I mean, Sam's answering some of the questions in the background, so I won't ask those. But, I mean, I guess one thing, and probably the final question based on where we're at with COVID and other things happening, I'd say the government will be looking for big infrastructure spends and things that can really boost economic activity. So whether that's big charging infrastructure rollouts or bus electrification or things that can be built here, manufacturing, obviously they're the big ticket items. I mean, is there a way of packaging that up for the industry as a kind of a way of promoting the next steps in terms of policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think what I'd say about what governments are looking at for whether it's during or post-COVID stimulus measures, you can tier it in respect of measures that will have an immediate impact. So how funding or other arrangements, particularly non-financial arrangements, given so much money has already been spent, can help bring forward investment, and that's really a construction or infrastructure rollouts are key there, and that is more to do with how immediately it results in electricians being paid and constructors being paid to do things, and then that next tier of work is first non-financial and then financial ways that more medium or long term. So whether that's people looking to establish new businesses, develop plants and equipment to manufacture vehicles, or assemble parts or whatever else. And I'd really sort of think about it of are your businesses in the area of immediate, even if it's immediate and something that government would say in the past of if this is something that you're going to do anyway, we're not as interested. If it's something that you're going to do anyway and they can get you to do it 2 years sooner, they're certainly going to be interested now. It is really about how can we provide a provide a jumpstart to use a good car fund to our economy.
Great, thanks. Well, look, we're getting close to the end. I'm not sure if there's anyone on the phone who'd like to ask a question. I'm aware that a few people have phoned in. You can jump up now, or otherwise we'll wrap it up in a couple of minutes. A roadshow of SC electric vehicles around Queensland. If they could do that in New South Wales. And I guess it's just that question of heavy vehicles generally. I'm really interested, I guess, from a Tesla perspective as well. Is that a thing, and how big is it going to be? Because obviously there's a lot of charging infrastructure. It's a very big, industry in Australia, logistics. So, I mean, any thoughts around the heavy vehicle space? And obviously, C Electric is innovating and moving forward pretty quickly.
Yeah, Dan, I think from a Tesla point of view, I can't add much of that other than what's kind of already been released in terms of the when production is likely to start for the Semi. But I think the same market dynamics that you see with passenger vehicles will apply to commercial unless we intervene. So we want to avoid having a situation where in 7 or 8 years' time, we're looking at charts of heavy vehicle electrification in Australia's as far behind as we are with passenger vehicles. And so I think a lot of the question, the answer to your question about kind of how quickly will that happen and what will happen is going to be about where we sit in the policy kind of pack and whether we encourage that to happen. But certainly, if I owned if I was making investments in truck depots, etc., I'd be very carefully thinking about their access to super fast charging and so forth, and starting to think about getting sites available and starting to look at where the placement of your depots and charging is going to be. I think it's going to be pretty real in a few years' time.
Right. Okay, look, I'll wrap it up formally. And as Behyad said, he's happy to answer questions afterwards. But thank you very much, Sam and Behyad, for that. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And as I said, Charge Together is trying to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles and low carbon transport in fleets. So we've got a number of other really good webinars. Next Wednesday, we've got one on building codes and standards with NHP and the Yarra Council. We've got a number coming up on the energy market with AGL and Ausgrid. So there's a number of good webinars on different topics. So please join us. Tell your colleagues to join us. The more people we get on board, up to date and educated, the better for the EV industry in general. And so everyone stay safe, and hopefully you can juggle the many challenges of the COVID experience. And we'll talk to you all later. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, guys.
Oh, thanks, Behyad.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.